With Jade Shadows, DE changed how hit points scale for all factions. This goes beyond just the elemental modifiers, which I covered in a recent guide. The actual damage you need to deal to kill enemies has changed fundamentally. I'll walk you through how level scaling works now and what this means for your builds. I'm the Engineer, let's solve a practical problem. For access to the analysis behind this video and other supporter benefits, you can become a subscriber on Patreon, meet the math and join other curious minds in the community. Warframe is utterly opaque about level scaling. We've all been there, looking at the star chart, seeing a mission is level 4 or 12 or 200 and trying to process what that number actually means. Unlike many other games, where a given level would mean all those enemies are on the same level, in Warframe it's used as a variable in hidden and complicated equations. These equations make it where a butcher level 128 has the same effective health as a heavy gunner level 40. What's more, this ratio isn't a simple fixed one. A heavy gunner isn't always about as tanky as a butcher that's 3 times its level. As the nature of level scaling has changed recently, I'll cover first how it is now, then I'll go into comparing it with the old system just gone. So let's start with the basics. What is actually scaling with level? All enemies have 3 basic traits which determine their hit points. They have their base values, their base level, and then their faction. The base values are observable in game when you open up the codex on enemies you've scanned into it. For example, this elite lancer has base armor 200 and base health 150. The faction is also observable here, with elite lancer being quite simply Grenadier faction. The base level is not shown in game, only found experimentally. Functionally, it is the first level at which the enemy should appear in game, and consequently the level at which they have their base armor and hit points. Below that level, should they be forced into existence, such as in the Simulacrum, they still have the same hit points as they will at base level. For enemies above their base level, their armor, health, shields and damage all increase. This increase is not linear, but instead uses some complicated power series to create a curve. On top of this, the curves are different for each faction when it comes to health and shields, as well as having a different curve beyond level 80 than they do up to level 70. The middle between these two is smoothed out with some fancy math, designed to literally smooth the step from one to the other. With so many variables in play, it's basically impossible to intuit how strong or weak an enemy is. If you have encountered a brand new enemy, or in a mission level you've not done before, there's no reference you can draw upon. After all, if you face a level 25 heavy gunner, a level 25 Oxium Osprey, and a level 25 boiler, which one has the most hit points? Or how about the most effective hit points? It turns out that the new system of level scaling has the heavy gunner as the weakest of these 3 units at that level. But if you scale all 3 up to level 50, it now has the most effective hit points out of those units. If this all seems a little crazy to you, that's probably the right reaction to have. This system has elite lancers and rogue Corvarians trade places 3 times on who has the most effective hit points as their levels climb. Instead, let's break this down by area of the game, using the same split as in the how long it takes to farm every frame guide I did last year. We have the very early game up to the end of Europa, the early game out to Sedna, the mid game covering non-Steel Path missions above Sedna's basics, and the late game for Steel Path missions and deep Archimedea. In the very early game, enemies increase their hit points multiple times over from level 1 to level 15. For example here, we have the Lancer, going from 132 effective hit points to 667 effective hit points. In most games, that would be pretty substantial. In Warframe, a few hundred hit points is absolutely nothing. The Sun and Moon, a weapon you can earn basically day 1 of Warframe, including its stance mod, will deal 1254 damage with a simple melee attack and just pressure point equipped. Suffice to say, that Lancer isn't standing up for very long. Other enemies that spawn at this level are similarly manageable. The imposingly tall heavy gunner reaches only 990 effective hit points, a charger just 564 hit points, and a mower 816 hit points. At that level, they're all manageable, which is why new players will typically find Warframe too easy at the start. Everything just falls over, especially to melee with its higher starting stats and ease of use compared to ranged weapons. Even extending mowers up to level 21, the far side of Europa, they're still on this gentle upward curve that asks for slightly more power from you, but nothing you can't handle, especially with a toxin mod. Something weird then happens at Saturn as one transitions into the merely early game, out of the tutorial levels. Not only is the level of Saturn starting at 21, it's back to the Grineer, and their new unit, the Elite Lancer, with effective hit points like this. In contrast to everything else, that's a stark upward jump in tank. They're not alone either, with the previously unconcerning heavy gunners back on Ceres turning into significantly meatier threats on Saturn, so much so they actually leap off the bounds of the graph I'm using here. It's from level 20 onwards that level scaling starts to noticeably kick in, as well as the introduction of heavier unit types. As this graph shows, with a selection of basic and heavier units, the hit points within each faction scales dramatically from the middle of the star chart to the highest base level it presents. Different factions and units scale at different rates, with Corpus Techs rising to overtake Elite Lancer effective hit points in this level range. Meanwhile, heavy gunners fall behind boilers for a while, but close back in at the later levels. It is this ramp up which fundamentally pushes all players from unmodded or poorly modded messes of weapons into making actual builds to compete with. Generally speaking anyway. As enemies continue scaling into mid-game, everything shifts again. Expanding the level range to just over 110, pushing the ends of sortie missions, all the effective hit point curves seem to make some strange wiggling moves. What we're seeing here is a combination of factors pushing against each other. The two red lines for Grineer units end up tapering off at higher levels as they've hit maximum armor, with heavy gunners hitting maximum armor when the level is still only in the 50s. Max armor is 2,700, however enemies achieve it, giving them a 90% damage resistance. Prior to 2,700 armor, the resistance value is based on this equation, simply 3 times the armor, square rooted, then divided by 100. How much armor a unit has is defined by its base armor and level. The armor scaling by level appears to be the same formula for all factions. At least, I didn't find any deviation. If an enemy at a given level would have less than 200 armor, yet more than 0, it instead spawns with 200 armor for a base 24.5% damage resistance. Between levels 70 and 90, all units have a brief but impactful upward swing as they transition from the low level scaling to high level scaling across the 70 to 80 barrier. The reason this doesn't happen for them all at the same time is because of their base levels being different. Standing out of all example enemies here is the Anatomizer, a murmur enemy which has a lot of hit points and stays strong all the way up the scale. Even when overtaken by the heavy gunner, it's still strong without needing armor and without offering a headshot for bonus damage. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the graph, elite crewmen have successfully become weaker than infested chargers, despite us being able to bypass crewmen shields with toxin damage. This weakness is also a big reason why faction-specific builds aren't as important for enemies like the Corpus. Your sheer damage values needed to beat other factions will also beat the Corpus, despite being the less efficient types. We're still in mid-game territory though. I know from surveys that the majority of players watching these videos are not in the mid-game. So let's see how it looks when we jump into Steel Path, from levels 100 to 300. The wild curves have pretty much all turned into gentle slopes. Once an enemy hits the armor cap of 2,700, assuming it has armor, the only thing left to scale is the far gentler increase of health and shields present in higher levels. There's still some difference in the equations, which means a level 120 Steel Path Boiler is weaker than Culverins and Anatomizers both, but outpaces them by the late 200s of levels. Crucially, the Culverins, Heavy Gunners, and Elite Lancers on this chart all max out their armor, meaning that 90% of their effective hit points is all in that. Remove that armor, and Elite Lancers become comparable to Elite Crewmen, while Heavy Gunners would fall below Corpus Techs. The unarmored Anatomizer and Boiler, however, do not offer such solutions, remaining a sack of hit points. These trends then continue unabated all the way out to level cap, with the Heavy Gunner reaching an eye-watering 61 million effective hit points, and the Anatomizer 16 million with no armor. So what's to stop you putting 61 million damage on a weapon and one-shotting everything? For enemies with up to that 61 million effective hit points, typically nothing. Grab your setup of choice and press the delete button, that's always an option. For more ordinary Steel Path or other late game missions, you'll often not need that level of obliteration to kill an enemy outright. Typical heavy units exist only in single digit millions of effective hit points. Xmas units can certainly test that, as they have a separate bonus to their health and shield values capped at 6 times by level 100. They also have overguard scaling that's very close to a straight line beyond level 50, so again a couple tens of millions outside of extremes of endurance. Some enemies however were made with this impossible to balance scaling in mind. Rather than having players anticlimactically one-shot very high-level boss units, I mean, who would dare do such a thing? DE have implemented various forms of damage attenuation. The formula they use is different from boss to boss and never published, but basically means that more damage in leads to more damage resisted. In weak cases, it makes you put in a lot more damage to reach a one-shot than you would need to whittle down the enemy over time. In strong cases, you functionally are fighting an invisible timer, waiting for enough damage to be permitted to seep through. But outside of those unique encounters, where power fantasies get hit with these conspicuous bullet sponges, a balance-defying hit of 2 billion damage will end the target, whether they like it or not. The remaining scaling feature left to enemies is their damage scaling. Each enemy has their base damage values hidden from us players. From there, they scale with their level with one relatively simple equation, making for a relatively simple curve. Even into endurance tier levels, it's just a simple curve upwards. At all normal levels, this curve is slower than enemy hit point scaling. Down to level 70, enemies just get worse and worse at dealing damage compared to tanking it, making them poor at hurting themselves, such as under the effects of radiation. Beyond level 70, this scales back up for non-armoured units, as their health scaling slows, but their damage does not. For armoured units, the extra gain to their effective hit points outweighs the damage increase forever. Again, once you take this to endurance levels, damage scaling turns in your favour if you're turning unarmoured enemies against each other. By the mid to late hundreds of levels, these enemies will now be dealing proportionally more damage compared to their tank than they did at level 1. This makes reflect damage like Octavia's mallet almost unreasonably strong in endurance missions. Outside of endurance though, or against armoured enemies with no attempt to remove their armour, the ratio is never in your favour. On Steel Path, the 2.5 times multipliers their hit points further cements this. Now up to this point, I've only talked about the current state of play and how level scaling works today. For this final section, let's cover some comparisons to how things were just prior to the Jade Shadows update. Much of the logic behind enemy scaling was the same, with various curves, varying base values, a similar kind of scope. However, there are some core changes which will have made and continue to make a difference to how enemies feel. For the Grineer especially, the big one is the armor cap. Now, Grineer enemies reach only a max of 90% damage reduction from their armor. Previously, they could far exceed this value, with a level 300 Steel Path Heavy Gunner reaching a ludicrous 36,569 armor. That's a 99.2% damage reduction under the old system, over 12 times stronger than the max today. And that's only level 300. At a level cap, they had the ungodly armor value of 500,000. That's over 13 times stronger again, or about 167 times stronger than the new max. DE have partially compensated for the drop in armor with a buff to the health scaling, though a level 300 Steel Path Heavy Gunner still comes out at about a quarter of the effective hit points they had before. That said, they do have roughly 3.5 times the base health as before. In fact, all Grineer at that level do. The basic star chart at level 30, most Grineer have 40% or so more health. At mid-game level 90, it's 160% more health. At Steel Path 130, it's nearly 200% more health. This means that builds relying on armor stripping or slash blocks have become weaker, while builds brute forcing through the armor have come out ahead. Other factions, it's different again, as they have also received changes to health scaling, all on a per faction basis rather than one unified equation per hit point type. Infested, for example, at level 30 are about twice as resilient as before, about 4 times as resilient at level 90, and slowly climbing from there to over 5 times as resilient beyond level 250. There's no compensation on this angle, they're just tougher than before. Armoured Infested, notably on Deimos, have a far less dramatic boost due to the armor cap. The Murmur broadly have not seen buffs, with Rogue Culverians having their EHP substantially nerfed due to the armor changes. At level 300 off Steel Path, they have about half their previous effective health with no change to base health. Or you keep shooting the shoulder off, that works too. Outside of equation changes, many enemies have also had entirely undocumented base stat changes. Some enemies, like Elite Lancers, Elite Crewmen, Oxium Ospreys and the Anatomizer, have all had their base level drop to 1, down from between 5 and 16. This is a buff, making each of those enemies effectively that many levels higher than they were before with no visible change in game. The Anatomizer, for example, at level 55 is 43% more resilient, simply because it's now got the hit points of a level 64 Anatomizer pre-update. Similarly, a level 20 Elite Lancer has gone from 206 health for 355 effective hit points to 1,306 health for 1,963 effective hit points, over 5 times stronger and over 6 times the hit points. The lower the level, the bigger these changes, having a profound effect for early game players. Strangely, not all enemies have had their base level drop to 1, and again, this change is entirely undocumented. Further to this, a number of enemies, notably Corpus, have had their base stats changed. Elite crewmen now have nearly twice the base health, yet lost a quarter of their shields. Mowers have gained 50% health and lost 20% shields. Oxium Ospreys have lost a token 7% health, but gone from 40 to 50 base armor, on top of their base level dropping from 5 to 1. This has wildly varying impacts on these units. At level 30, most are a bit stronger, except with Oxium Ospreys 75% stronger, and Elite Crewmen 307% stronger, mostly due to the base level shift. Up onto Steel Path level 130, this is closer to a 60 to 80% EHP increase for unarmored Corpus. Well, it would have been, except for a bug. Dee's patch notes suggest Steel Path shields were being double buffed by the 2.5 times modifier, making them over 6 times their usual values instead. If we take that into account, the changes actually leave some Corpus with lower effective hit points than before, and even those coming out on top have moved a lot of tank to health rather than shields. So the Corpus have become weaker and their unique defense weaker, while incidentally making the toxin bypass of their shields less effective, but still plenty effective to be worth using. There are so many changes across the board, so many moving parts, and staggeringly so many undisclosed changes that there's no single positive or negative value trend to latch onto. The big takeaways are that the major factional strategies, that's armor stripping for the Grineer, shield stripping or bypassing on the Corpus, still work but are much weaker. Various enemies have become silently stronger, especially impacting newer players as they hit the second half of the star chart. The Infested have had a health buff in general, which is surely overdue given their reputation for being laughably squishy. Overall, it's been a big shake-up. This has been a very detail-heavy video. I hope you can come away from this video knowing more about Warframe's level scaling and understanding how it impacts you. If I've left you with some unanswered questions, you can pop by my live streams on Twitch to get your practical problems resolved right there and then. That's all from me for now, so as always, climb ranks, beat tanks, and fight well, Tenno.